A debt ceiling crisis requires three ingredients: Republican control of the House of Representatives, a Democratic president they can scapegoat, and, most importantly, a Republican Party controlled by an extreme right wing of legislators willing to tank the U.S. economy if it gives them increased notoriety with the disillusioned base they helped create.
This morning, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the U.S. will hit its debt limit Thursday. She is now calling on Congress to suspend or raise the debt ceiling to avoid a default.
The United States government reached the debt ceiling on January 19th, and the Treasury started implementing extraordinary measures to keep the government paying its bills. This is a very dangerous position for the U.S. because the order of events usually goes extraordinary measures, partial government shutdown, default on payments. A U.S. government default on payments would be an economic event so costly that economists have resorted to calling this event X date. To avoid default, somewhere in this process, Congress needs to raise, suspend, or eliminate the debt ceiling before we get to X date, which would unleash never-before-seen damage to the United States economy.
That is an economic death spiral.
Here is a brief summary of the threat we face from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen.
A failure to make payments that are due would undoubtedly cause a recession in the U.S. economy and could cause a global financial crisis. It would certainly undermine the role of the dollar. Many people would lose their jobs. Every American would see that their borrowing costs would increase as well.
So, this is a bad spot for the US to be in, and it's all self-inflicted pain. The United States is the only government in the world to have such a debt ceiling that restricts its own treasury from paying government bills owed. I guess technically Denmark is another country with a debt ceiling, but it's set at more than 3 times the size of their total debt and raised accordingly so they would never hit it. So, the US is the only country with this type of crisis. And for the past 30 years, it happens every time the government is composed of these 3 ingredients.
I now have the high honor to present to the House of Representatives our new Speaker, the gentleman from Georgia, Newt Gingrich.
Not surprisingly, it started when Republicans took the House for the first time in 40 years, and Newt Gingrich introduced his new brand of Republican militantism. Gingrich didn't have the votes to override a Clinton veto on the budget, so he threatened to not raise the debt limit and shut down the government. This set the precedent for the extreme right wings of future Republican caucuses.
This is it! It's the 5-alarm fire!
When Republicans took the House in 2010, they were controlled by the extremes of the Tea Party caucus. This far-right faction kept the United States government on the verge of default for the entire 6 years. From 2011 through 2016, the United States Treasury was forced to resort to extraordinary measures 5 times. Extraordinary measures had only been used 3 times in the previous 70-plus years of the federal debt ceiling. The turmoil resulted in a 16-day government shutdown in 2013 and a downgrading of the U.S. debt rating in 2011 that shocked U.S. financial markets.
For the first time in the history of the ratings, Standard & Poor's downgraded the United States credit rating late Friday. Congress passed a debt reduction package at the 11th hour that averted a possible default, but that did little to change the outcome.
Today, it's the so-called Freedom Caucus, a rebrand of the Tea Party demanding massive cuts to benefits for the middle class and poor, where they will sink the economy into debt default. But what is their excuse for risking a national economic meltdown? Why do they refuse to raise the debt ceiling when a Democrat is president, but happily raise the debt ceiling when a Republican is president?
The deficit's the worst thing in the world when Barack Obama's president, but Donald Trump came in and, we're not so worried about that anymore. Do you think your colleagues, the Republican Party, will rediscover its concern about debt and deficits?
Sure.
I mean, isn't that the most cynical, phony thing?
There's an
doesn't
element
that
of
make
it.
you want to puke?
1 week after the Treasury notified Congress of the debt limit, Republican senators from the Tea Party Freedom Caucus held a press conference. An analysis of this press conference answers a lot of questions about the GOP's motive for holding the debt ceiling hostage. First question, why won't you raise the debt ceiling?
The greatest threat to our national security is the debt.
The overall number is simply too big.
I would vote for an increase in the debt ceiling if we attach to it certain fiscal controls.
That's reasonable. The national debt is a concern. So what's your solution?
The increase in the debt ceiling must be accompanied by cuts in federal spending,
fiscal controls, or other spending cuts.
A $100 billion cut in free spending.
or meaningful structural reform in spending.
Okay, so you want to make cuts to the federal budget, but what about the other side of the debt? Raising revenues from taxes, particularly from the wealthiest individuals.
The whole idea that you can raise revenues to do it, that's not going to work.
And what is your evidence that raising tax revenues won't balance a budget?
In Europe, over half of the countries balance their annual budget. We think of Europe, of Germany and Sweden, of having these large governments, and they do, but they're actually fiscally responsible in the sense that they spend what comes in.
Literally, all of the fiscally responsible European countries Rand Paul just mentioned collect a higher percentage of tax revenue than the United States. That's how they balance their budgets, by implementing the exact economic policy Republicans refuse to even consider, and by not doing exactly what Republicans are proposing today.
Well, the number one component of the solution is economic growth, which is why we cut taxes in 2017, moving into 2018, and it worked.
No, Ron Johnson, it did not work. The Trump tax plan before COVID led to the greatest increase in the national deficit since America entered the Great Recession.
We agreed to increase the debt ceiling, whether it's once or twice. We need to attach to it fiscal controls or other spending cuts.
Okay, so your plan is all cuts, no raises in tax revenue. So what are you going to cut?
Exactly what those are, we're not willing to lay out here today.
Why is it such a struggle for even a group of conservative senators here to identify what to cut?
That is a really good question.
We're the board of directors, okay? You don't go to the manager and say, this is cut your budget 10%. And then you have those managers do it. So there have been a number of proposals in terms of doing that. But again, we're going down this process, structural process in place. Thank you.
Republicans don't care about decreasing the debt. They care about increasing income and wealth inequality in the United States by cutting government benefits for the middle class and poor while keeping taxes low for the wealthiest families. The countries that balance their budgets,
We think of Europe, of Germany and Sweden,
also have less income inequality, less poverty, and a better standard of living. And Republicans certainly don't want that. Look, the national debt is a problem, but it is the economic policy of the Republican Party that is responsible for the overwhelming majority of that problem. I've talked a lot about this in other videos, so let me try to sum this up quickly. Since Reagan, all 4 Republican presidents, over 24 years in power, have never had a single year where they posted a lesser deficit than the one they inherited from their Democratic predecessor, even when adjusted for inflation. Every Republican president said they were worried about the debt.
The federal budget is out of control, and we face runaway deficits of almost $80 billion for this budget year.
Our money's gone, our wealth is gone, we owe $20 trillion. $20 trillion. And we haven't done anything.
Every Republican president said low taxes is the only way to fix it. Never has a Republican president ever had a single year where he decreased the deficit compared to the last year of his Democratic predecessor. In 18 years of Democratic presidents, every single year the deficit was less than the deficit their Republican predecessor left them with. Republicans are not anti-debt.
You belong to a party that has greenlit a historic expansion of deficits and debt. And it's just a plain fact.
They are anti-spending on the middle class and poor.
In terms of how you eliminate the deficit and move towards reducing the debt,
you're going to say growth.
The most important factor. Trump's policies have been profoundly pro-growth.
Yeah.
The tax cut.
Also profoundly pro-deficit.
The debt ceiling gives Republicans the opportunity to hold the country hostage, threatening economic Armageddon if the government doesn't enact more of a proven flawed economic policy based on a broken ideology. And it's an effective strategy, because the United States absolutely cannot default. But we also can't negotiate with legislators who are willing to just let the country burn.